So I'll go ahead and ask you guys the same thing that I did with the other classes. I said, okay, if we're going to be sending troops, how many troops do we need in order to stop the spread of communism? 2 million? I think that'd be a good number.
Double theirs.
Double theirs?
Yeah.
Okay.
10 million.
10 million? Okay. All right.
7 million.
That's a lot. I don't want to do the math for you, Alex, but it's more than there were people on Earth at that time. So that would be hard. But now we're in a situation where we got to think, well, if we have to put boots on the ground, let's use all the advantages that we have. When we get actually involved, when we are now going to be at the forefront, where it's up to us to stop the spread of communism, we got to think about what advantages do we have over tiny Vietnam? And it's made real obvious real fast. We have an overwhelming amount of superiority when it comes to firepower. What President Johnson says is, we are going to use firepower to our advantage. And I'm going to use his words, not mine. What President Johnson says is, we are going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. There's something that President Johnson doesn't really quite get, though. Vietnam is kind of already in the Stone Age. Now, I say that because I want to set up something a little bit later on. The way that the Vietnamese have been fighting against invaders for years is very simplistic. Now, this is a whole new type of firepower that they have not yet seen. Our bombing is going to begin in 1965. But this is only one phase. We're going to send American troops in country as well. Our first American combat troops are going to arrive in 1965, as now it's up to us to stop the spread of communism. We're going to start to bring these American troops in very kind of piecemeal early on. But the more troops we put in there, the bigger it gets very quickly. In 1965, we're going to have 200,000 troops on the ground. Alex, you okay with that number or no?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, because you said 7 billion before, was that right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, this is a little bit less than that. 2 years later, we're going to have 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. Is this going to be enough to stop the communists?
7 billion.
7 billion is now the number that you need. This is where there's kind of this odd problem. 500,000 American troops. Overwhelming firepower. This should have been a recipe for success. But the problem is we're fighting an enemy that we are ill prepared to fight. We're not fighting a conventional war here. We're not fighting a war like we had in the past. In Korea, there were battle lines, there were uniforms. You are fighting against North Korea. In World War II, there are battle lines, there are uniforms. You're fighting against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. In Vietnam, we're not fighting against a group like that. We're fighting against Vietnamese guerrillas. And those guerrillas have been fighting against what they perceive as invaders for literally hundreds of years before us. Vietnam has been invaded countless numbers of times. I gave you guys a real short synopsis of their most recent invasions. They were taken as a French colony in the late 1800s. The French hold them until they're occupied during World War II. The French get kicked out, and who's just the next invader? Not yet. Japan comes in. Japan invades them and colonizes them. Then when at the end of World War II, the Japanese are kicked out. Then who comes back? The French invade them again. And then the French get kicked out. Now these Americans are in here, and what the Vietnamese see is you are just the next invaders. What the Vietnamese do to the Americans is what they do to all invaders. They fight as guerrillas. Now, we're going to talk more about how they operate in just a little bit, but I do want to kind of give you just a little further window into the firepower that we're going to bring. The idea is we are going to crush them with American firepower by air support and any means that you can bring this kind of firepower with. The idea is to just overwhelm them, break their spirit, bring so much firepower that they simply can't resist anymore. Stop the spread of communism. I want to give you a number, but it's kind of hard to conceptualize. So I need to say this in such a way where it brings about something tangible that goes with it. During Vietnam, in just the first few years, we're going to drop a little over 3 million tons of explosives on tiny Vietnam. That number is more explosives than we dropped during all of World War II, including both atomic bombs. That's how much firepower we're bringing to tiny Vietnam. But the weird thing about it is, again, we're not fighting a conventional opponent. In World War II, we had real specific targets. Hit factories, hit communication, hit bridges. Real simple targets. Simple, clear targets. In Vietnam, we don't know who the enemy is. And I say that because when you're fighting against guerrillas, you have people who are farmers by day and soldiers by night. They don't wear uniforms. They don't identify themselves. There are no battle lines, you're on this side or that side. It's a 360-degree battlefield. You don't know who the enemy is because they hide amongst the civilians, the people you're there to protect. So I will tell you this little story because it's hard to fight against guerrillas. Let me do it like this. Do you remember, we talked about guerrilla warfare even back in the late 1800s when the Cubans were rebelling against the Spanish Empire? General Wheeler goes to Cuba and is told, you can do whatever you want to defeat these guerrillas. And what Wheeler does is what the textbook says you do when you're fighting against guerrillas. Now, I'll ask you guys first. Do you remember? What did General Wheeler do in Cuba? How did he take care of this? Ethan, you remember? Yeah. What Wheeler did is what you should do. This is what the textbook way of dealing with the guerrilla warfare is. You isolate the guerrillas from the civilians. Now, the way Wheeler did it is, like I said, pretty much classic. He herds them all into internment camps, all the civilians, and says, if you're not in the internment camp, then you're considered a guerrilla. Now, I will ask, do you remember, how did it work out for General Wheeler? Or even how did it work out for the Cuban people that were in those internment camps? Remember what happened to them? They starved to death. So yeah, it's what the textbook way of dealing with it, but you can't do that. You can't herd civilians into internment camps. It's not morally correct. So you got to figure out another way of deciding who's the guerrilla and who's the civilian you're there to protect. This is a quote from an American soldier that sums it up so well. If you're fighting against guerrillas, you never know who was the enemy and who was your friend. On countless occasions, there are American soldiers who write about how they're there to help these people, protect them from the communists. And little do they know that that person they're helping is the communist. We're fighting against an idea. And on these countless stories, I'll just pick one. There was an American Marine who ran across this man in the middle of the Vietnamese jungle. He was unarmed. He didn't have any weapons on him. And he says to this Marine, as best he can, where he's surrendering, and he says, I need help. So this Marine literally picks up this guy who was wounded and carries him back. It was right about 2 miles back to his base and puts him down, and he says, I'm going to go get you food. I'm going to go get you medicine. I'll be back. He gives him food, gives him medicine, does as best as he can to kind of heal this guy. And that night, that same man slit the Marine's throat. and disappeared back into the jungle. This is who we're fighting against. It's an invisible enemy. You never know who you're against, because the Vietnamese have been doing this for literally hundreds of years. I give you just a little window into their invaders. They've been invaded countless numbers of times. And really, every time they're invaded by a superior opponent. So the Vietnamese have developed some things as to how to resist, how to fight back. And one of the biggest things they have going for them is their terrain. Most of Vietnam is this really thick, dense jungle. And when I say dense, I mean it's even hard just to walk around in this jungle. It's that thick. Now, when the Americans are in country, average height of an American troop was about 5'10". Average height of a Vietnamese guerrilla was about 5'2". These big, clumsy Americans are walking around in the jungle, and we're literally walking through the Vietnamese guerrillas' backyards. They are very familiar with this kind of terrain. Not to mention, they are considerably more familiar with what Mother Nature poses as a problem as well. In Vietnam, not only are we fighting against these guerrillas, this invisible enemy, but we're fighting against elements as well. In the Vietnamese jungle, there's one of the most poisonous snakes in the world. It's called the two-step snake. Because if it bites you, you get 2 steps. Now, yes, that snake is incredibly dangerous, but what these American troops have said is that maybe one of the most dangerous animals they face in the Vietnamese jungle are elephants. Now, I will tell you, these are not the gigantic African elephants. They are much smaller. But when I say a small elephant, it's still really big. And elephants are really dangerous. Because if they get scared, what they do is they head stomp you. They basically just do a headstand and crush you to death. Now, I know this in a weird way. I have not been head stomped by an elephant, okay? I know this because a friend of mine is, actually kind of, a friend of mine is the head of the elephant exhibit at the Denver Zoo. It's a really cool job. If things go well. One time I saw him and his arm was in a sling and had a cast on it. And I said, Mike, what happened to you? And he goes, yeah, the elephant broke my arm. He's like, no one gets to say that. No one is ever like, oh, those elephants. So I asked him, like, what happened? He goes, well, I was trying to move Daisy into a different spot in her exhibit. I'm like, first of all, you named an elephant Daisy. And he's like, oh yeah, Daisy's really friendly for an elephant. And I said, okay, well, how do you move Daisy into a different part of the exhibit? And he goes, well, usually she responds when I just push her. Oh. I'm like, so let me get this straight. You were pushing an elephant? He goes, yeah, I was trying. So he's trying to push her. He's like, come on, Daisy, let's go, come on. And she looked back at him. And what he says is, he goes, at that point I knew I was dead. Oh. But you're here. He says, yes, Daisy took pity on me. Daisy looked back at him and smacked him with her trunk, knocked him over, and broke his arm. And then Daisy slowly walked to the other part of the exhibit. Could she have killed him? Without a doubt. And even he says, like, yeah, I'm not surprised she didn't. But she liked me. That's what he says. So elephants are really dangerous. And in the jungle, they're actually like really hard to see. These American troops would just walk up on these elephants, not knowing they're there, and the elephant gets scared. So they just smash them. That's just one other problem we're dealing with. Now, the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, or the VC as they're called as well, are tactics that have been used for hundreds of years. In fact, the Vietnamese have little booklets that they hand out to the guerrillas, and within those booklets, it has all sorts of information. These booklets were written about 1,000 years ago. Now, those little booklets have all this information on how to resist, on tactics, on training, and just information to thrive in the